Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming out on a Tuesday evening. We shifted our date this week from our normal schedule, so thanks for paying attention. I'm Bill Brown with Brookings Mountain West. On behalf of my colleagues, as well as all our friends here at Greenspun College who help us put on this event and record it and get it up on our website, thanks again for coming out. We're really pleased to have our colleague Vonda Felber-Brown back out from Brookings. She's spoken to us before on her experiences in Afghanistan. She also spoke to us on the global water crisis. But she's here tonight on another topic with a great lecture title. If I had an award, I'd give it one, I think. It's Narco Noir, Mexico's Cartels, Cops, and Corruption. And it's the basis of some deep research she's done on this topic. Let me tell you a little bit about Vonda. She's a senior fellow in the Center for 21st Century Security and Intelligence in the Foreign Policy program at Brookings. She's also director of a project, Improving Global Drug Policy, Cooperative Perspectives, and UNGAS 2016, and co-director of another Brookings project, Reconstituting Local Orders. So her global experience in some of the most troubled and dangerous places in the world gives her a unique perspective to talk on this topic tonight. I know you'll enjoy hearing from Vonda.
Good evening. Thank you very much, Bill. It is a great pleasure to be back, and I see in the audience some old friends. Thank you for coming. I look forward to our conversation. Well, I am delighted that Bill approves of the title. It's actually stolen from my forthcoming book. It's exactly the title of the book, Narco Noir, Mexico's Cartels, Cops, and Corruption. And the book should be out next year. When Bill and I were conceptualizing my talk some months ago, I really wanted to focus on the Mexico situation, and I will, but I would be remiss not to reflect on US-Mexico relations and how security issues affect both sides of the borders, given how much that has been part of the conversation in the United States, particularly by President Trump and previously candidate Donald Trump. And really, I don't say this lightly, and I don't tend to be prone to hyperbole, but I would say that we are on the cusp of an unprecedented rupture in US-Mexican relations over the past 2 decades. It's not a rupture that's historically unprecedented. Much of US-Mexican relationship over a long time has been very troubled and very difficult, with drug policies and anti-crime efforts being a key source of the tension. And that peaked in some ways in the 1980s. And since then, US-Mexican relationship at the government-to-government level, not simply community-to-community level, have been steadily improving. And much of that improvement came since 2006, and even prior to that, as a result of cooperation on anti-crime issues, on how to deal with the massive challenges that Mexico faces in terms of violent crime. And much of that can really be fundamentally lost as a result of the rhetoric that candidate Trump and President Trump has adopted, that has not been mitigated, and that is affecting not simply US-Mexican economic relationship and issues having to do with NAFTA, but also the security cooperation. President Trump frequently alleges that drugs and criminals are flooding the United States, are spilling in great quantities over the border from Mexico. And he made it a centerpiece of his policy with Mexico to build the wall, which will presumably stop these bad flows and bad hombres, as he refers to them. In fact, the situation is far more complex than that. Mexico itself is caught up in extraordinary violence that has not lessened. And despite very extensive US-Mexican cooperation during the George W. administration and administration of then Mexican President Calderon, and also the cooperation between the Obama administration and the current Mexican President Enrique Peña Nieto. But the violence in the United States, it's not driven by Mexico. It is not Mexican criminal groups that are engaging in violence here. And even the most violent cities, such as Chicago, Baltimore, New Orleans, are really suffering from US policing problems and US domestic local criminality that in elusive ways intersects with drug smuggling. There are fights over local retail markets, but they are not the fights between the big drug cartels that we see in Mexico. So what is really extraordinary to me is the great difference with which Mexican criminal groups behave in Mexico and with which they behave in the United States. In Mexico, extraordinary violence. In the United States, extraordinarily peaceable relations. And the violent criminality and homicides are driven by local gangs, mostly of either African-American community, from African-American communities or Latino communities, but people who are by and large born in the United States. These are not violent drug cartel members coming across the border and engaging in violence here. And I significantly fear that the policies that President Trump is proposing, both in relations with Mexico, but also domestic policing policies and domestic immigration policies, will both undermine and perhaps completely eviscerate US-Mexican security cooperation, anti-crime cooperation, but also significantly undermine the effectiveness of US domestic policing. So I fear on both fronts. Now, I have suggested several times that violence in Mexico is extraordinary levels. What is the violence? Well, since 2007, perhaps up to 200,000 people have been killed in Mexico in drug-related violence. Those are just extraordinary numbers. Those are numbers at the level of a country in a civil war. They are not the highest murder rates in the world. Central America, Northern Central America, places such as Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador are suffering from even higher violence rates. And that is one of the reasons why people from those countries are trying to enter the United States and obtain asylum or even cross the border illegally. But nonetheless, they are extraordinarily high violence numbers. Bill mentioned that I also do work on Afghanistan, and the numbers of deaths, drug-related murders in Mexico have been, until recently, much higher than the number of deaths in Afghanistan, in a country with very intense, very robust and expanding insurgencies. Think about that. And the number of deaths, of course, is not the entirety of the effects that the violence has on society and on state-society relations. There are many economic costs to the violence, and there are social costs to families, psychological costs. Large parts of the country have seen people who are experience post-traumatic stress disorder, children experiencing that, as well as migration. People are moving out of the most affected violence part of Mexico, being internally displaced to other parts, perhaps in the tens of thousands. We don't really exactly know those numbers, as there has been little official tracking of them. And of course, the numbers of homicides that are known probably do not capture the entire numbers of homicides, nor do they necessarily capture also the number of people who have disappeared, which again the numbers varied, but are in the 20, 30, perhaps 40,000 again, there is great disputes about those actual numbers. Some of you might remember that several years ago, the Time magazine published a picture of President Peña Nieto after his first year in office with the title, "The Savior of Mexico." And President Peña Nieto deserves, I think, a lot of credit for pushing through some very important economic and social reforms, including the privatization of the state oil company and efforts to promote education reform in Mexico. The education system in Mexico is uniquely poor, even by Latin American standards, and of course greatly affects both productivity but also social opportunity for people. So he leaves in a year and a half the office with some significant accomplishments and significant legacy. But that legacy is also tarnished, to use the very strong word, by the violence that still goes on in Mexico. When he was elected, and during his election, he campaigned on promising to reduce violence in Mexico by 50%. And in fact, the latest numbers from 2016 is that violence is back at the peak levels of the Calderon era, with over 20,000 people killed in Mexico last year, 20,000 people that have been identified in drug-related violence. And some of the previous hotspots that were assumed to have been pacified, such as Tijuana, Ciudad Juarez, are experiencing significant resurrection of violence, and violence has spread to other parts of the country that had seemed previously stable. Now, how is it that we got here? You know, how is it that all of a sudden in 2007 and the decade subsequently, Mexico is caught up with this unrelenting and excruciating violence that is at the levels of a country in very intense civil war? Well, there are both proximate triggers, but also sort of deeper patterns. And so if you indulge me, let me a little bit take you back to the historical perspective, which I think is fundamental. During much of the 20th century, Mexico was ruled by the PRI, the Institutional Revolutionary Party, that really dominated not just political life in Mexico, but all aspects of political organization. The PRI, in combination with the so-called imperial presidency, was able to centralize decision-making and rule the country through a so-called corporatist arrangement. And that system of rule, with the PRI delegating power and assets to those that supported the PRI through patronage system and denying it others, also extended to organized crime. And so the PRI would essentially have a de facto deal with criminal groups that as long as they smuggled drugs into the United States, which they did for decades, but did not engage in great significant violence in Mexico, they would not be suffering too much action from Mexican law enforcement. And in various parts of Mexico, that relationship went considerably deeper and was more extensive, because local politicians, known as caciques, would often use organized crime groups to deal with their political rivals and to maintain political control over local populations. So back in the 60s and 70s, some of the organized crime groups were de facto militias of local politicians. They also would engage in smuggling drugs to the United States. And key Mexican law enforcement agencies were also very much involved in this management of the criminal groups, selectively acting against those that behaved problematically, but more or less as long as the groups operating within the parameters of limited violence in Mexico and obedience to the PRI and the local law enforcement institutions, they would not suffer too much action. Now, inevitably, that management policy suffered blowback, and over time, it stopped being the law enforcement institutions controlling the criminal groups, and it became the criminal groups that deeply infiltrated and corrupted Mexican law enforcement. So by the 1980s, key Mexican law enforcement institutions would be so corrupt by the drug trafficking groups that the capacity to deter and impose rules on the criminals became very eviscerated and very hollowed out. And the 1980s is a period of other massive changes in Mexico, the series of economic crises which weakened the imperial presidency, weakened the PRI, and ultimately, a decade and a half later, result in the end of the PRI rule and democratic system and elections, and truly accountable and truly meaningful elections in Mexico. Moreover, a big change also comes in the 1980s, where the principal drug of use in the United States becomes cocaine. And when drug trafficking shifts as a result of US interdiction efforts from the Caribbean to land routes through Mexico. So all of a sudden, the stakes that the Mexican criminal groups have in controlling territories and being the principal actors engaged in smuggling drugs into the United States become much higher. The profits are just so much higher than profits from marijuana or even heroin, which has been produced in Mexico in various times going back to the 1940s. Poppy has been cultivated both for legal drugs, supplying, for example, the United States during World War II with legal opiates, as well as illegal ones. And so the 1980s become this perfect storm of the Mexican drug market being reorganized and leading to increasingly the 1990s, where the criminals now have huge stakes, they're making huge money, and they no longer fear Mexican law enforcement or the imperial presidency, and become more and more aggressive in their actions. And Mexico, the Mexican government, as it goes through process of democratization, is well aware of the challenges that organized crime poses to the state. And it tries to adopt a series of police reform that nonetheless do not result in great effectiveness, but seed some of the seeds of the policies that are adopted ultimately by President Felipe Calderón in 2006. And that are enormously contentious in Mexico today. Crucially, the use of the military to go after the criminal groups. Now, back in the 1990s, the military is not used for that purpose, but retired, or not even retired, military officers are being increasingly appointed to key policing posts, to keep law enforcement institutions, and people who are soldiers in the Mexican military often leave it and join, for a variety of reasons, local policing forces. So the not official but de facto process of militarization of Mexican anti-crime policy starts taking place right then. Now, in throughout most of this period, US-Mexican relations in the sphere of law enforcement are very tense. There are many suspicions in the United States about the level of corruption of Mexican law enforcement, and particularly in the 80s there is a famous incident in which a US drug enforcement agent called Kiki Camarena is betrayed by his Mexican counterparts. He's operating undercover in Mexico and is gruesomely tortured and killed with the complicity of top-level Mexican government officials. And so that brings US-Mexican anti-crime cooperation at the official level to just about a zero. And that deep freeze continues even as NAFTA comes about, US-Mexican political and economic relations improve. Mexico is the last country with which the United States develops military-to-military relations only late in Latin America, only late in the 1990s. And it's only after that that there is a thaw and some law enforcement contacts and law enforcement cooperation become resurrected. And then President Calderon is elected, and is elected president. And when he is elected president, he reaches out to the United States and makes anti-crime policies a key priority. Now, there are several reasons for why he does that. One is that he comes from Michoacan, which is one of the central Mexican states, and one of the states that has, but it's fairly close to Mexico City. It's connected by a great highway, but at the same time, it's a state where large parts of the territory have very weak state presence. It's not, an accurate statement to say that the state is not at all present there. But in parts of the state and parts of Guerrero, one of the most troubled Mexican states, the so-called Tierra Caliente, it is really criminal groups that rule, the people who rule territories. In some of the villages, you will not be able to enter the land in Tierra Caliente unless you have a permission from the local drug trafficking group or local criminal group. And it is in, President Felipe Calderon comes from Michoacan. He's well aware of the situation there. And Michoacan is also experiencing the rise of a new breed of cartel at the time, La Familia Michoacana, which is very explicit about its political project, but it's also very explicit about not only smuggling drugs and extorting local businesses, such as avocado farmers, logging companies, but also about saying that they are better providers of rules and order than the state. They claim that the state is negligent. They embrace aspects of Christianity, that they cloak their criminal political projects with, and they organize local courts that distribute justice or order. And they are also very violent. And so some of the actions that they engage with that quite break mold with the behavior of criminal groups is the first decapitation of victims. They throw heads of several people into a disco, and that's the first incidents of such kind in Mexico, which become replicated in other ways. They also throw grenades into a crowd during a fiesta, again killing innocent civilians. So there's this religiously cloaked entity that talks about a political project beyond simply a criminal enterprise right in the home state of Calderon. And Calderon then decides to deploy the military to the state to suppress the criminality. And he needs to get a legal exception to achieve that. But he also sort of justifies the move by saying that the police are so corrupt that they cannot be trusted with the project, that it has to be the military which is presumed, and probably at the time is not so afflicted by corruption in relations to the criminal groups. And that the military will only be deployed as long as it takes to restore peace and order, which he believes would be a matter of 2 or 3 years, and until the police is reformed. So 6 years after his presidency, order is not achieved in Mexico, and violence spikes up greatly. To a large extent, the violence that spreads to many other parts of Mexico is driven by fighting between some of the key cartels, The Sinaloa cartel is one of the key villains. It's pushing into areas of other cartels, into Ciudad Juarez, into Tijuana. Is trying to expand its territories. Other cartels become even more brutal than La Familia Michoacana, most famously during that era, the Zetas, who used to be enforcers of the Gulf cartel that strike on their own, and they push the level of brutality even higher than other groups. Interestingly enough, the cartels make really choices almost in the same way as governments do as to how they will rule. That's I mentioned that Sinaloa was the villain because they became so aggressive into trying to expand their territories. That also have been arguably the most successful of Mexican cartels since the 1990s, not because of their aggression, not because of their brutality, but because the cartel has spent a great deal of effort to deliver social handouts, to give money to local churches, to build local soccer stadium, to organize fiesta, and to provide employment to people that would otherwise struggle to find employment in a country that is still very bifurcated. 40-some% of people in Mexico still live below poverty line, which is defined as about $180 per month. And so the Sinaloa cartel has chosen to rule by providing a great deal of governance services and handouts, suboptimal, hardly matching the state, certainly not accountable, but trying to buy political capital. And when its most famous capo, El Chapo Guzman, was arrested for the third time and ultimately extradited to the United States, he was seen in its home state, Sinaloa and other parts, as very much a folk hero, despite the fact that he was a key organizer of the aggression and the violence. Other groups, like the Zetas, have chosen to rule through other ways, simply through brutality. And so it's not only the great numbers of deaths that have characterized the Mexican reshuffling of the organized crime market and the infighting within the criminal groups and among them, but it's also other associated violence that has been just extraordinary. The level of torture in kidnapping, the manner of torture, is something that's very much, I don't want to say copied, that's too strong a word, but certainly informed by some of the brutality in the Middle East by groups like Al-Qaeda in Iraq and subsequently ISIS. That is, again, really unique. It's both unique historically in Mexico, but it's also unique by other criminal markets. I often contrast how differently drug trafficking groups behave in East Asia, where the amount of drug produced, drug trafficked, and drug consumed is no lesser than in Latin America, perhaps even greater, and yet violence rates are less than 1 per 100,000, maybe 2 per 100,000. Whereas in Latin America, we speak about tens per 100,000 in the most extreme cases, even topping 100 per 100,000. And so the East Asian criminals tend to behave in a very non-violent way, whereas the ones in Latin America, not just Mexico, but throughout Latin America, in a very violent way. And so again, the level of torture, brutality, as well as the numbers of deaths have been really unique in Mexico. So one source of that violence is the behavior of the criminal groups themselves, but that violence intersects with government policies. And particularly, it is the so-called high-value targeting approach that has underpinned the policy of President Calderon and ultimately also of President Peña Nieto, that has been an indirect source of that violence. That policy essentially rests on the notion that if one arrests or kills the top heads, such as El Chapo, the organizations will collapse and be weakened. Well, that has in fact not happened, at least not happened fully. The organizations have not collapsed. They did, however, splinter. And so what maybe in 2006 were maybe 6, 7 most prominent criminal groups fighting among themselves, today it's perhaps 2.5 times the number, so well over 15. And moreover, many of the groups are very unstable as a result of this targeting policies, and so they fight not only with their rivals, but also they fight among themselves. So there are multiple sources of pressure toward a very violent criminal market. But one of the consequences of that fragmentation has also been that not all of the criminal groups can make their living on smuggling drugs into the United States. And so one of the big effects has been that the groups have resorted to generalized extortion. And it's not simply smuggling drugs into the US or smuggling drugs from Central America into Mexico. These days, many of the criminal groups also demand money from the illegal smuggling of migrants. At the same time, the abuse and violence that Central American undocumented workers or asylum seekers have faced in Mexico is also just extraordinary. But they also extort all kinds of companies that operate in the areas where they have some influence. So in Michoacan, they extort avocado farmers, all kinds of agriculture, mining, logging, general businesses. And if one does not pay, then it's not only that her or his store might be burned down, but the family might be affected. And so it is in the states that have seen this greatest level of extortion that anti-crime militias have emerged. So that's another almost warlike dynamic in Mexico, where it's not simply the state fighting the criminal groups and the criminal groups fighting among themselves and within the group, but that we have seen an emergence of militias. And the militias claim to step into the failures of the state and to provide more effective order, but in fact they have by and large become corrupted themselves and become just another form of criminal groups. Now there are also militias, there are also local self-police forces by indigenous populations that go back several decades, several years prior. Those are separate from the anti-crime militias that emerged subsequently. And the Mexican government has really struggled in how to deal with them. President Calderon was often quite indifferent to the violence, and he would often say that the levels of violence were a sign of success, or he would make the argument that the violence didn't matter very much because it was criminals killing criminals. Now, that's, in my view, deeply flawed policy, deeply flawed analysis, because the violence does affect broad society. The criminals are not killing each other on the moon, they're killing each other on the streets of Mexico and debilitating lives of some communities. So President Peña Nieto then came in and said, I will bring violence down, 50% reduction in my first year. And in fact, there was a reduction in his first year, but that reduction by and large cannot be attributed to government policies. What happened at the end of Calderon era is that some of the groups were defeated, the Zetas were significantly weakened, La Familia became also quite fractured, and other groups emerged in their wake. And so several of the most contested territories, such as Ciudad Juarez, Tijuana, or Monterrey, saw the emergence of a new criminal ruler. In fact, what was established is something that I called in my work a narco-peace. A group became dominant and was able to impose enough territorial control to deter significant aggressions and to reduce violence because the city or the area of the city stopped being an actively contested zone. But because of the persistence of the high-value targeting policy, some of these narco-peace areas have become weakened. And more significantly, the Peña administration did not want to focus on security issues. It wanted to prioritize and focus on economic and social issues, also reading the tiredness of the Mexican people with the violence. And so the areas where the narco-peace emerged were left to their own devices. But because the narco-peace was at the discretion of the cartels, when the cartels lost the capacity to fully control the territory, and then by fully controlling the territory, I have to be sure that I don't mean that you couldn't go to Ciudad Juarez unless you got the permission from Chapo to enter there. Fully control the criminal market in the city is what I really mean by that term. The state was not trying to significantly change the balance of power toward the state. The peace was a very problematic peace for many reasons, including because it was at the discretion of the cartels. And over the past 2 years, we saw the emergence of a new criminal group, some ways the successors to the Zetas, Jalisco Nueva Generación, that is again being very aggressive and pushing into established territories, particularly of the Sinaloa cartel, but also elsewhere. And so that has brought violence levels in Ciudad Juarez, Tijuana, and elsewhere very much up. So last year in Mexico was essentially as bad as the worst year of the Calderon era. Now I'm mindful of the time that we have and want to allow space for questions. So let me just tick off, just list some policy options that Mexico can and should adopt to reduce violence and to make the anti-crime policies more effective and lasting. I am not particularly hopeful that this will happen in the remaining year and a half of or 2 years, but essentially a year and a half of the Peña administration. But it's nonetheless imperative, and I hope to be wrong, and I hope that the Mexican president will make that his number one issue. Of course, the United States doesn't make it easy because we are telling him that his number one issue needs to be the renegotiations of NAFTA. And NAFTA is critical for Mexican economy. It has also big impacts on security. The more poor, unemployed people without remittances, without legal livelihoods, the greater societal dependence on crime. So it's very inevitably a crucial priority for Mexico. So I expect that the remaining energies will be focused on the NAFTA renegotiations, and the attention will be diverted from anti-crime policies. And so I suppose this is the third way in which I think the Trump administration policies are undermining security in Mexico and are undermining security in the United States. So one of the things that I think Mexico needs to adopt is to move away from this policy of high-value targeting. It's not that the top capos should be let free or shouldn't be targeted, but simply eliminating the top boss or the second lieutenant is not sufficient to prevent a new boss to emerge. In fact, it only creates more competition, including violent competition over power. What is far more effective in disabling a group and reducing the immediate violence and contestation over territory is to focus on targeting the middle operational layer of a criminal group and try to arrest much of that group in one sweep. That is indeed also how we do a lot of policing against organized crime groups in the United States. The difficulty with moving to this middle layer targeting is that It requires requires considerable intelligence and considerable strategic intelligence, not merely technical network intelligence, and it also hence requires time. So there are periods when there is no one to demonstrate, one to show to a camera to demonstrate that the government is being active. Crucially, Mexico needs to significantly double down on police reform. It's a very difficult issue. President Calderon was way too optimistic in assuming how quickly he can pull off police reform. He didn't. It's the single most difficult institutional reform a country can undertake, and it often requires well over a generation of officers. In Mexico, it remains very much a work in progress, with particularly the local police forces being the weakest, most vulnerable, most corruptible, most coercible element. A number of years ago, I was doing research in Querétaro, and a local villager in the Tierra Caliente gave me a very pithy line about a local police officer. He told me, look, if you have some brains, you'll get out of here and you'll make it across the border to the United States. If you're not smart enough to do that, you will join the local crime group, the local drug group. If you're really stupid, you will become the local cop. Now, you know, if that is the societal attitude toward police officers, it's of course very difficult to assume that the police officers would risk their lives and the lives of their families to combat criminal groups if you essentially assume that you are so incompetent. But the issue of police, local police and broader police reform goes way beyond that element. And so resurrecting momentum on that is very important. And part of that is continuing to dismantle the militias. Again, very much a unfinished project. I also need to emphasize the need to double up focus on the justice reform system. We can talk in Q&A about what has been achieved. Mexico switched from an inquisitorial Spanish-like system to an accusatorial one. That's in my view, very important progress, but long time to effectively implement it. And impunity rate for homicides still remains about 98%. So essentially anyone can get away with crime. So, whereas in the United States, the effective prosecution rate, unless you are in Chicago or Baltimore, for homicides will be around 50, and possibly higher. And it's not that that 50% of homicides are unresolved, but you have plea bargains. So dramatically different numbers. And there's an important need to make socioeconomic anti-crime policies more effective. That's something that President Calderon was reluctant about, funded in Ciudad Juarez. President Peña Nieto embraced, but dispersed throughout the country, and ultimately many of the policies have not been coherent, have not been systematic, the socioeconomic policies. And finally, I need to speak about the issue of justice and human rights. One of the consequences of deploying the Mexican military has been significant increase in severe human rights abuses, with not just great crimes perpetrated by criminal groups, but mass murders, extrajudicial killings, torture, rapes, other serious crime perpetrated by police forces and the military in Mexico. Again, much to be done. That part of that is also dealing with corruption. I want to end by saying that Mexico will not be helped by building the wall. And I don't think that the United States will be helped by building the wall. Drugs will still make its way to the United States, whether they are flown by drones or brought by boats, or whether there are tunnels dug under the wall, or most easily are hidden in legal cargo. Nor do I believe that our aggressive policies to hunt down undocumented workers, which the Trump administration is making its hallmark of policies, will help with dealing with violent crime, which, with some exceptions, is very, very low in the United States. It will only alienate communities from law enforcement and in risk creating the attitude that if you are the cop, you're either stupid or you're evil. And that's the opposite of what we need as a country, as a society, what our law enforcement needs. It is having good relations between citizens, having respect for our law enforcement officials, for the dedication and risks they face. But it also means that they cannot be seen as enemies of communities, of tearing through communities. I give this talk feeling both great sadness in where we are in Mexico and significant challenges where we are in the United States. Bill, shall I take the question? Please, sir.
You mentioned that several of the presidents in the past have used the military as an law enforcement or some sort of a counter narco gang force. Has the military largely avoided being subsumed by the narco lords? And if so, how have they avoided it when we know the federal police have not?
So I have to clarify that formally as an institution, it was only in 2006 under President Calderon when the military has been deployed to do policing. Prior to that, officers from the military would be posted within law enforcement institutions as the leaders, but the entire military was not deployed, and you would not see what you see in Mexico, what you saw so much during the Calderon era of military patrolling the streets. We have not seen sort of as dramatic evidence of the highest levels of the Mexican military being penetrated by drug trafficking groups as were the revelations with various police and law enforcement forces. However, I think that there is significant undermining of the integrity of the institution by the revelation about torture, extrajudicial killings, and mass murders that are a different form of corruption and different form of institutional undermining, but no less significant to me. And that's been very much an issue, and it's an increasing issue, and Mexico will have to do much more accountability on that. In fact, the U.S. military, U.S. cooperation with Mexico, as with other countries, conditions a part of the assistance on certifying that the military is not engaged in severe human rights abuses. And there have been years recently where the US would simply deny that money because of the level of problems with the military. Please.
Yeah, is there any relation between cartels and sex trafficking, and do you have any numbers?
Well, numbers are hard in sort of all dimensions. So there are two aspects to it. Is the relationship between sex trafficking in the United States and sex slavery, sex trafficking in Mexico. There is very strong evidence that the cartels have demanded, extorted, and abused female migrants that have been smuggled and enslaved them. There are much more sort of sporadic evidence that there's been some sex trafficking into the United States. However, I think it's a bit too simplistic to say that it's the cartels that are behind it per se. And even the cartels that operate in the United States do not control in the United States territory. They often franchise or collect taxes from other criminal groups. So the issue of US sex trafficking is conducted by Mexican cartels, is alleged it ever so often appears in press. I think that the evidence is much more complicated, and I wouldn't make the claim. In Mexico, depending on territory, the local sex market might be totally controlled by the criminal groups, but both in terms of voluntary prostitution and in terms of sex trafficking. I don't think that's the case in the same way in the US.
Very, very interesting talk, and I guess this is a question that impacts, I think, our side and also even Nevada here, because our gun licensing, gun control is relatively weak. What is the impact, and I guess this has gone back for many years, the discussion, but what do you feel is the impact of weapons trade into Mexico, and certainly is there any from here that could be enumerated as important?
Yes, thank you, and I am glad that you raised it. You know, one of the downsides of giving it all is all the things that you don't talk about, and so the issue of U.S. demand for drugs and gun control and the weakness of gun control in the United States are paramount to the story. The vast majority of assault weapons that come into Mexico appear to come from the United States. The numbers are disputed. Some put it as high as 92%. And it's because it's so easy to have to engage straw purchasers in the United States and smuggle weapons. And so for a long time, there is a sort of tit-for-tat blame. The United States blame Mexico for the drugs that come here, and the Mexicans say the violence here is your fault because of the guns that are coming to Mexico and because of U.S. demand for drugs. I mean, one of the important breakthroughs during the Calderon-Bush era, and that lasted through the Obama-Peña era, has been to move away from just this mutual recrimination and say, it's the fault of your drugs, no, it's the fault of your demand, you have terrible violence, well, it's the fault of your guns, but to adopt the concept of joint responsibility. And so the United States has tried to crack down on gun smuggling into Mexico, and has also tried to crack down on the smuggling of bulk cash from the United States to Mexico, which is principally how the criminal groups move their money. And it's not really made a lot of difference. The U.S. Anti-gun smuggling efforts still remain weak. You know, again, the Trump administration is focused on the wall. It wants to stop the bad flows from Mexico to the U.S. It really has not said how it plans to stop the bad illegal flows of guns from the United States into Mexico. And once again, the guns are mostly smuggled in legal vehicles. It's not something that is necessarily carried through desert crossing, so the wall is not what will make a significant difference. So yes, the issue of illegal gun outflows out of the United States to Mexico are very much part of the issue and the conversation.
Yeah, well, I guess just this week there was an article about Mexican manufacturing in Tijuana, medical devices. On Thursday in the economics department, there's going to be a seminar on how a new rail line to the suburbs of the state of Mexico increase student choice of high schools in the state. So all this gives the impression of, you know, really a normal society. So, you know, to what extent does the violence impact that and change that for the majority of Mexicans?
So, you know, that's again an excellent point, and sort of drives home how much Mexico remains still a very bifurcated society. So if you're part of the elite and live in certain parts of Mexican state or Mexico City, in the Zona Rosa, and some of the affluent neighborhoods, the odds are high that you will read about crime but not experience crime in any way. Even in other parts of the country, that take Michoacan, a very violent contested state, I suggested that the Tierra Caliente is really ruled by criminal groups. Again, if you are the elite in Morelia, the capital of the state, you might not experience it, and you can probably drive without much of a risk on the road between Morelia and Mexico. But over the past several years, violence is not just viscerally visible, but is actually spreading and affecting even, for example, the safety of traffic. It varies. In terms of economic issues, we have not seen that major capital flight, for example, or we have not seen US or Asian companies divesting out of the maquilas, but they spent a considerable amount of their budget on security. So the companies, instead of leaving a war zone, decided, because of the investments and because of the great economic benefits that NAFTA created in the border areas and beyond the border areas, to invest in significant security. But insecurity might be affecting their workers. So Tijuana is a great example where people work in the maquilas. The maquilas will have security around, but they will often have to travel 2-3 hours from the colonia in Tijuana to get to the maquila. And they face significant risk along the route. There have been attacks on the buses. More significantly, they face various forms of extortion and violence in the colonias itself, because the maquilas attracted population migration through various parts of Mexico, but that urban growth was not accompanied by any urban development. So many, you will have neighborhoods of tens of thousands of people without clinics, without preschools, without schools. So not only do the parents leave, say, at 4 a.m. to get to the maquila and work 8, 10, 12 hours, and then spend another 3 hours to get home, but once the child leaves school, he or she will be spending hours on the street and are vulnerable to recruitment by criminal gangs and experience violence related to criminal gangs. So the socioeconomic urban underdevelopment associated with the maquila growth is significant. Now, at the same time, I mentioned that the poverty rate is about $180 per month, and a local cop in Mexico will make probably that, maybe $200 per month. People who work in the maquila will make about $1,000, so significantly more than that. And yet there are other dimensions of their life that are still very problematic, very inadequate, and that feel the social dislocation that intersects so much with criminality. And there is also the issue of, many of the children, because of poor education and distant parents or absent parents, drop out of school, and then they often do not have employment, or they don't have education. They drop out of school and then are very vulnerable to recruitment. So at the 2011-2012 assessments made of how many people were part of the gangs fighting in Ciudad Juarez, in that city alone, the numbers were in the tens of thousands. Please.
So, because these crime organizations have a lot of operational control, like within Mexico, and evidently also have some sort of control within the government of Mexico, because you said earlier that some police officers were being sort of compromised from the outside. Can the Mexican government, are they even able at this point to enact any sort of reform to combat criminal organizations?
Yes. Again, so Mexico is this bundle of contradiction. Mexico is not a failed state. There is a functioning government. It is a middle-level income country. If you travel to Mexico City, you will experience a very wonderful country, a very modern state that might feel like being in the United States, and some of the stores and the shops in prominent cities really look like modern United States, and some are beautiful historic places that look very much in Mexico but feel very peaceful. So, it's not that Mexico is a collapsing government, collapsing country, that the state is gone. It's a very bifurcated country. And again, life in Morelia is fairly different, and the look of Morelia is very different than the look of a village that might be perhaps only an hour away from Morelia. So yes, the Mexican government does have a lot of capacity to undertake reforms, and it needs to. The reforms, however, take time, and doing particularly police reform is a very long-term, very complicated project. Similarly, the reform of the rule of law system, the change from the inquisitorial to the accusatorial system is a very long-term project. The Mexican government does have the capacity and resources at the national level in particular to promote and to engage with the reforms and to have sustained, but it needs sustained focus on it. It's much more challenging at the level of local government, where local governments often have minimal taxation capacities, they don't have local taxation capacities, so they need to rely on what the central Mexican state hands out to them, and for the state then to mount more effective policing there, for the local governments to mount more effective policing, to mount more effective socioeconomic policies for anti-crime purposes. Often is much more of a challenge. So the real issue is how to bring accountability and policy effectiveness from the big, from the capital and from some of the big prominent cities, and to bring them throughout Mexico into the areas where the state has been historically weak or absent, or where it outsources rules to the old politicians or even to the criminal groups. Please. Bill, you tell me when we need to.
Oh, you mentioned earlier that the cartels don't have control in the United States. Roughly, it's more independent American criminal organizations that have control of the violence. But some of the drug supply comes from Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
Could you just expand on how that relationship is between Mexican cartels and the local criminal organizations in America? Sure,
and it varies, and the picture is not uniform. Mexican criminal groups are believed to be the principal wholesale suppliers of drugs to the US, with the Sinaloa cartel being one of the largest and most significant, but hardly the sole one. So they range either through their own operators or through local franchises to bring drugs, and often drugs change routes. They don't, however, necessarily control local retail markets. They will look for local retailers that are gangs, and not always gangs, to be selling the drugs. So they bring it wholesale, to be very simplistic. They'll bring it wholesale to the US, but the local retailers are US-based groups. And in essentially franchise arrangement. And the violence in cities like Baltimore, Chicago is often over local retail markets. That said, these departments have a long, very troubled history. The cities have a very long, troubled history of violence that precedes in many ways fighting over local retail markets, that in the cases of Chicago also has to do with tremendous racism, the huge division between the white community and the African American community. So a much more complex picture. So you have several cities that have been troubled for, frankly, decades, with very high violence rates in the US, and they continue to be troubled, and the fight over the local retail markets is the sort of latest dimension of that fight.
Let me just, I always hate to have to cut off our conversation, but I want to be respectful of your time and our speaker. Thank you so much for making a complex and evolving topic, giving us that kind of depth and background. I hope you all feel better informed on a subject that's going to continue to be of direct interest and importance to the United States, and particularly to us in the West. So thank you again. Thank you all for coming and for your great questions. We'll be around for a few minutes. If you have an unasked question, we'll try and get to it. And I don't have a lecture to plug for next week or the rest of the semester, so I just encourage you to, if we have your contact information, you'll be hearing from us electronically. If not, please make sure we get it, because we'll be announcing our lecture schedule and other events for the fall and spring semesters. Thanks again for coming.